It was an unseasonably bright morning for late September in St. Aldwyn's, the kind of morning that made even the most steadfast villagers believe the summer had decided to linger just a little longer. The sun warmed the worn stone walls of St. Aldwyn's parish church, casting long, gentle shadows across the green. The bells were not yet ringing. They would begin their call to worship in half an hour. But already there was movement in and around the churchyard. Mrs. Judith Pembroke, the vicar's wife, bustled about near the entrance, arranging a vase of late roses on the small table, where pamphlets, hymn sheets, and the donation box sat. She had a fondness for roses, and even more for appearances, and though the parishioners might not have noticed wilting petals or a slightly lopsided arrangement, she would have noticed, and that was quite enough to justify the fuss. Just beyond the church gate stood Mrs. Harper and Mrs. Finch, leaning slightly toward one another in that unmistakable posture of village conversation that hovered somewhere between harmless information-sharing and unabashed gossip. "It's not natural," Mrs. Finch was whispering, not nearly as quietly as she believed, "to be off on one's own like that. People are bound to talk." "Oh, they've talked for years," Mrs. Harper replied with a sniff. "But this is something else entirely. You didn't hear? She was seen coming from the post office crying." "Crying?" Mrs. Finch's eyebrows lifted high with delight, though she would certainly deny such a word. "My goodness, what could possibly have—" The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted them. They straightened at once, their expressions smoothing into composed politeness. Miss Jane Marple walked toward the gate, one gloved hand resting lightly on her cane. The cane was not strictly necessary. She moved more briskly than women 20 years younger, but it lent an air of gentle frailty that Miss Marple had found terribly useful over the years. She greeted the ladies pleasantly. "Good morning, Mademoiselle Harper. Mrs. Finch. A fine day, is it not? One might almost forget how close autumn is." Mrs. Harper nodded, though her eyes flickered with the unmistakable urge to tell Miss Marple everything she had just been discussing. Miss Marple, for her part, was in no particular rush to hear. If something was worth knowing in St. Aldwyn's, it would reach her soon enough. "I believe I saw young Dr. Edmund Langford headed to the vicarage earlier," Miss Marple added mildly. "He seemed in something of a hurry." "Oh, him," Mrs. Finch said, with a touch of something sharp beneath her tone. "Well, it's no wonder, after what happened with—" But the sentence was never finished. A scream, high, sharp, and shocking in the still morning air, pierced the churchyard. It came from inside the church. Mrs. Pembroke's vase toppled and shattered as she fled back from the entrance, trembling violently, her hand clutching her throat. Miss Marple and the others hurried forward, though Miss Marple did not rush. She simply walked, steadily, purposefully, into the church. Inside, the cool air smelled faintly of beeswax and old hymn books. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass in gentle shades of gold and blue. Everything looked peaceful, except, of course, for the body. At the front of the church, just behind the first pew, lay Colonel Arthur Godfrey. He was dressed neatly, as always, dark jacket, polished shoes, his silver hair combed back with meticulous care. But now his head rested at an unnatural angle, and his skin had turned a waxy pallor that left no doubt. Colonel Godfrey was quite definitely dead. Mrs. Pembroke stood near the altar rail, hands pressed to her face. "I found him. I only went to place the hymn numbers on the board, and Dr. Langford, who had evidently heard the commotion and returned swiftly, knelt beside the body. He checked for a pulse, though everyone watching knew it was futile. His jaw tightened. "He's been dead for at least half an hour." the doctor said quietly. He must have come early to prepare something. He did like to rehearse his readings. Colonel Godfrey was scheduled to do the second lesson today. Miss Marple's eyes traveled slowly across the scene. She did not look at the body first. Bodies are simple, she often said. It is the living who are complicated. Her gaze instead drifted to the pews, to the hymn books resting neatly in their wooden pockets, to the small brass reading lamp at the lectern, to a tiny piece of torn fabric, black wool, on the edge of a pew, far from where the colonel lay, and then very slightly, her eyes narrowed, because there was something else, too. The colonel's spectacles, always perched precisely on the bridge of his nose, were missing. Dr. Langford rose. "We must send for the police at once." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "You must." Mrs. Harper dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Who could possibly want to harm Colonel Godfrey? He was such a respectable man. Miss Marple didn't answer. She simply looked once more at the empty place where the spectacles should have been. Outside, the Sunday bells began to ring. But there would be no service today. Mrs. Finch placed a trembling hand on the back of a pew to steady herself, though her eyes, bright with horrified fascination, did not leave the body on the floor. Word of the discovery was already spreading. The church doors stood open, and the quiet Sunday calm of St. Aldwyn's was replaced by quiet clusters of neighbors gathering in the churchyard, curiosity pulling them as surely as any sermon ever had. The vicar, Reverend Pembroke, had arrived by then, his face pale beneath the gentle gray at his temples. He whispered a prayer under his breath, as Dr. Langford gently suggested that the church be cleared. Mrs. Harper guided a still-shaken Judith Pembroke outside, murmuring soothing words that did very little to soothe. The villagers, though reluctant to leave, slowly drifted back into the late morning sunlight, like moths emerging from a darkened room. Miss Marple remained near the front pew, her hands folded neatly before her. She watched without appearing to watch, how Dr. Langford wiped his hands with a handkerchief, the controlled steadiness of his movements, how the Reverend avoided looking too directly at the colonel, how Mrs. Finch, outside, was already speaking in a low tone to anyone who would listen. Gossip spreads faster than alarm in a village, and far more efficiently. By the time Inspector Graves arrived from the nearest town, the churchyard had become a gathering of speculation. He was a broad-shouldered man with a sensible expression, one who preferred clear motives and neat conclusions. Graves had worked with Miss Marple once or twice before, though he remained politely skeptical of her contributions. So, he said, after speaking with Dr. Langford and the vicar, no signs of a struggle, no weapon, and nobody saw him come in this morning. Miss Marple glanced up, her voice mild. Colonel Godfrey was always very disciplined in his habits. He wouldn't have found it unusual to arrive early, especially if he intended to reread his scripture. Inspector Graves nodded curtly, though his attention drifted back to the body as it was gently placed on a stretcher. We'll know more once the doctor gives us a cause of death. At first glance, well, I wouldn't be surprised if this was natural. Miss Marple did not contradict him, but she looked again, quietly, thoughtfully, at the absence of the spectacles. The colonel had been nearly blind without them. He never went anywhere without those round, polished lenses and the small tear in the fabric along the pew. Not an accident, she thought, but she said nothing yet. Outside, the villagers parted as the stretcher was carried through. Mrs. Finch gasped audibly. Mr. Creighton, the local grocer, removed his hat. Children watched from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed and hushed. The bell had stopped ringing, leaving only the distant calling of wood pigeons in the trees. Poor Colonel, Mrs. Harper murmured, shaking her head. Such a dignified man, always kept to himself, of course, but that's nothing to hold against a person. Nothing? Mrs. Finch echoed, her eyebrows rising. Well, I suppose some people could overlook his, strictness. He did have a way of being forceful. Miss Marple caught that word, tucked it gently into her recollections, and allowed the conversation to continue. Villagers reveal more when they don't feel they are being asked. Forceful? She repeated softly. Oh, yes. Mrs. Harper leaned closer, especially regarding his niece. You know, the young lady staying with him this past summer, Emily. Such a sweet thing. But the Colonel kept a tight rein on her comings and goings, particularly after that business with the handyman. Mrs. Finch nodded vigorously. He dismissed the poor fellow for merely speaking to her in the orchard. Terribly embarrassing for the boy. Miss Marple thought of the tear in the pew fabric and the missing spectacles. Small things, ordinary things, and yet crimes, she knew, were built from the smallest impulses. Inspector Graves emerged from the church, wiping his brow, and the scattered villagers retreated a polite distance. Very well, he announced. The cause of death is under examination, but until further notice, Colonel Godfrey's death will be treated as suspicious. No one is to leave the village until more information is known. A murmur passed through the crowd. Fear, excitement, and discomfort blending into a familiar village hum. Miss Marple remained still, her expression one of sympathetic concern. She had seen many villages and many tragedies, but St. Aldwyn's was not accustomed to murder. She noticed then someone standing apart from the crowd, quiet, pale, watching the stretcher disappear down the lane with a stiff, troubled posture. Emily Godfrey, the niece. Her eyes were red, as though she had been crying long before this morning's discovery. Miss Marple observed her for a long moment, not accusing, not deciding, simply recognizing that grief comes in many forms, and guilt in even more. The investigation, she knew, had only just begun. Emily seemed aware of Miss Marple's gaze, though she did not look directly at her. Instead, she turned and walked toward the narrow lane leading away from the church, her steps quick and uneven. Miss Marple followed, not immediately, not in the manner of someone pursuing, but simply by taking the same path a short while later. The villagers dispersed slowly, still humming with speculation, but the lane ahead had already grown quiet. Emily had stopped beneath the broad branches of an old chestnut tree, her shoulders trembling. Miss Marple approached with the same gentle tact she had used to soothe crying children and restless garden birds. "My dear," she said softly. This must be quite a shock. Emily turned, startled, and tried to compose herself. Yes, it is." Her voice wavered. "I can't quite believe it." Miss Marple nodded, understanding that disbelief was sometimes easier to manage than grief. Emily's hands were clasped together so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. The girl looked very young now, not much past 20, if that, though her eyes held something older, something wary. Colonel Godfrey was a respected man, Miss Marple began, choosing her words with care. And yet it is often the case that those who are admired can also be difficult in private life. Emily's breath caught just slightly before she spoke. He meant well, I suppose. He believed rules were necessary, discipline, structure. She hesitated. "For my own good," he would say. Miss Marple gave a small hum of thought. She had heard such justifications often. They rarely covered kindness. "It must be very lonely," she said, "when one's choices are not one's own." For a moment, something in Emily's face wavered, something frightened and sad, and possibly relieved to have been understood. But before she could speak, footsteps sounded on the gravel behind them. Dr. Langford appeared, his coat still unbuttoned from his hurried return to the church. His expression was kind, but guarded. "Emily," he said, gently but firmly, "you shouldn't be alone. Come to the vicarage for a while. Mrs. Pembroke is making tea." Emily nodded, though she did not move right away. "Thank you, Edmund." There was something in the way she said his name. Familiar, but restrained. Miss Marple noticed the doctor's jaw tighten by the smallest fraction. Grief was not the only emotion present. Dr. Langford hesitated, then glanced at Miss Marple. "You noticed anything unusual? Truly unusual? The inspector seems ready to treat this as natural, unless evidence says otherwise." "Sometimes evidence speaks softly," Miss Marple replied. "One must know how to listen." Emily turned sharply, confusion creasing her brow. You don't believe he died naturally, do you?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she asked, "Did your uncle wear his spectacles when he left the house this morning?" Emily blinked. "Of course he did. He couldn't see properly without them. Why?" Miss Marple offered a gentle, sympathetic smile. "Curiosity, my dear. Simply curiosity." Dr. Langford placed a guiding hand at Emily's shoulder, and the two walked slowly back toward the village. Miss Marple remained beneath the chestnut tree, letting the breeze rustle the fading leaves above her. If the colonel always wore his spectacles, and if they were now missing, then someone had removed them, and one does not remove a dead man's spectacles unless one has reason. The question was not merely who would do such a thing, but why they would want the colonel to be seen. By the villagers, by the police, as a man who had simply collapsed where he stood, behind Miss Marple. The church bell rope swung gently in the still air. An attempt at silence, she thought. But silence, like truth, never lasted long in a village. The small path that led from the church back toward the village green was dappled with shifting sunlight. Miss Marple walked it at an unhurried pace, her thoughts calm, layered, quietly arranging themselves as naturally as cards falling into order. The air smelled of cut grass and distant chimney smoke. It should have been a peaceful morning. By the time she reached the vicarage gate, she could hear the low murmur of voices inside. Villagers, drawn instinctively toward tea and collective speculation, were already gathered in the vicar's sitting room. Mrs. Pembroke poured cup after cup with mechanical precision, though her movements were still unsteady, her face pale. Emily sat in the corner of the room, her hands wrapped around a teacup she did not drink from. Dr. Langford stood near her, speaking quietly, but Miss Marple noted the way Emily flinched at sudden sounds, how she seemed to shrink from the attention of others. Her grief was not loud, it was guarded. And then the door opened again. A tall young man entered, dark-haired, shoulders squared, wearing a rough tweed jacket still dusted from outdoor work. He paused, scanning the faces, and Miss Marple recognized the flicker of tension in the room. It was Peter Hill, the handyman who had once worked on Colonel Godfrey's estate, the one dismissed over a conversation in the orchard. Emily's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer. Peter removed his cap, nodding politely to the vicar, though his jaw was set. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. "Is it true, then? The colonel gone?" Reverend Pembroke sighed gently, his voice worn. "Yes, Peter, I'm afraid it is." Peter's expression did not soften. It tightened instead, grief and resentment at war behind his eyes. "Shame, that," he said quietly. "However a man was, death closes the book." Mrs. Finch, unable to resist a well-placed stir, leaned forward. "You must have been surprised, Peter, considering how things ended between you." A hush spread like a ripple. Peter's shoulders stiffened, and Emily's breath caught, just loud enough that Miss Marple heard it. The handyman's voice, when he spoke, was steady. "I was dismissed. That doesn't mean I wished him harm." Dr. Langford's eyes flicked up. "We know that, Peter. No one is suggesting you—" But of course everyone was suggesting it. Peter nodded once, sharply. "If you say so, Doctor." His gaze traveled briefly toward Emily, just a second, but charged with meaning, and then to Miss Marple. Something in his expression recognized her not simply as a quiet old lady, but as someone who knew things. He left the room without taking tea. Mrs. Harper exhaled in that way meant to invite further comment. "Well, a dramatic exit always looks suspicious, doesn't it?" Miss Marple replied gently. "Oh, not always. Sometimes it simply looks painful." The room fell quiet. When the inspector returned later in the afternoon, he brought news. Initial medical examination suggested the colonel's death was not natural. A bruise was found beneath the collar, faint but unmistakable. Pressure applied to the throat, enough to silence breath. A quiet, deliberate killing. Several villagers crossed themselves. Mrs. Finch gasped, delighted and horrified in equal measure. Dr. Langford's gaze narrowed, thoughtful and troubled. Inspector Graves wasted no time. "Peter Hill has a prior grievance with the deceased. He'll be questioned." Emily stood abruptly, her voice breaking for the first time. "No, you can't think Peter would do something like that." "He wouldn't. He couldn't." But the inspector's mind was already forming neat lines and tidy conclusions. Miss Marple's voice, soft but unwavering, broke the tension. "Perhaps we should not be too swift in placing guilt, Inspector. The colonel knew many people, and many held opinions of him, not all of them affectionate. A man's past can be extensive." Inspector Graves gave her a polite, restrained nod. "Of course, Miss Marple, but motive combined with opportunity, yes," Miss Marple said, eyes resting calmly on Emily's trembling hands. "That is often what we look for first. Yet very often it is not what solves the crime." The inspector hesitated, unsettled by her certainty. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the low window, where the village green lay quiet beneath the afternoon sun. Children played there earlier, but now it looked oddly still. In the silence, something clicked neatly into place. Someone had tried very hard to make the colonel's death seem ordinary, which meant the killer had to be someone the colonel trusted enough to meet with, alone, before the service. Someone who knew his routines, someone who could remove his spectacles without struggle, someone inside the circle, not outside it. The village, Miss Marple thought, was much smaller than Inspector Graves realized. The afternoon sun slanted lower, turning the village green into a tapestry of long shadows. The news of murder had settled over St. Aldwyn's like a fine dust, quiet, unmistakable, and clinging to every doorstep. People spoke in lowered voices now, as though sound itself might disturb something fragile in the air. Miss Marple walked home at her usual pace, neither hurried nor slow. Her garden gate, painted pale blue, creaked as she passed through. She set her gloves nightly on the hall table, removed her hat, and placed the kettle on the hob. She did everything as she always did, for routine steadies thought. And she was thinking, the spectacles, the torn wool, Emily's frightened restraint, Peter Hill's bitterness, carefully held in check, and Dr. Langford's concern, genuine, but not simple. There were threads. They would reveal themselves, if tugged gently. The knock at her door came just as she was pouring the tea. She opened it to find Dr. Langford, his expression lined with fatigue. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Not in the least," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Do come in." He took a seat, though he seemed restless, his hands clasping and unclasping. "I needed to speak to someone who isn't." He gestured vaguely toward the village. in the middle of the excitement of it all. "They're ready to hang Peter Hill already." Miss Marple handed him a cup. "And you disagree?" The doctor exhaled. "I've known Peter since he was a boy. Hot-headed, perhaps, but not violent. And he admired Emily. Admired too much, perhaps. Colonel Godfrey made a spectacle of punishing him for it." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "You sound as though you disapproved of the Colonel's treatment of his niece." Langford's eyes flicked up, just once. "I thought it was cruel. Emily suffered a great deal under that house." A pause. "Is that why?" Miss Marple asked gently. "She was seen crying at the post office yesterday morning." His silence confirmed what she needed to know. He tried to recover. "I shouldn't speak of private matters." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One learns a great deal from the way a person chooses what not to say, Dr. Langford." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time she saw the depth of his worry. Not fear for himself, but for Emily. "She's more fragile than she looks," he said quietly. "If the police continue pressing her, questioning her, she may break under the strain, and that will ruin her, even if she is innocent." Miss Marple set her cup down. "Emily is not a child, Doctor, but she is frightened. The question we must answer is why. Not merely grief. There is more beneath it." Langford swallowed. Her uncle was arranging a marriage for her. A man from London. Wealthy, older. She didn't want it. "She told me so." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her thoughts sharpened. A guardian forcing a marriage. A young woman seeking escape. A dismissed suitor already in the village. A doctor who cares more deeply than propriety would suggest. All motives. All powerful ones. But motives alone do not kill. No murder grows from motive and opportunity. And something else, too. Knowledge. Someone had known the Colonel would be alone that morning. Miss Marple walked the doctor to the door. Before he stepped out, she spoke quietly. "You must prepare yourself, Doctor. There will be another revelation soon. Truth rarely stays buried when emotions run this high." He looked troubled, but nodded and left. Miss Marple stood in the doorway a moment longer, her eyes drifting toward the twilight sky. Then somewhere in the distance, the church bell rope gave a single, unbidden sway. No breeze, no wind, just movement, a sound like something being disturbed. Miss Marple's gaze narrowed. Someone had returned to the church, and someone had something to hide. The evening light was thinning into the soft gray that came just before dusk, as Miss Marple stepped out once more. She did not hurry, for haste often made one noticeable, and Miss Marple preferred to arrive like something already expected. The path to the church was cool beneath the trees, and the village, though hushed, felt watchful. The church door was slightly ajar, very slightly, no more than the width of a finger, not the way Mrs. Pembroke would have left it. Miss Marple slipped inside. The air was different than before, still cool but tense, like a breath held. The faint scent of beeswax polish lingered, but now there was something else beneath it. Wool, damp leaves, and the faintest trace of cologne. Not the Colonel's. A figure stood at the far front of the aisle. Lean, head bowed, hands gripping the pew before him. Peter Hill. His shoulders were rigid, as though he were bracing himself against the stone floor. Miss Marple didn't make a sound. She merely remained where she was, letting the quiet settle. After a moment, Peter spoke without turning. "You think I did it, don't you?" His voice was low, but not angry. Weary. Miss Marple replied with gentle clarity. "I think you cared for Emily. That is clear enough." Peter drew in a sharp breath. "Yes, and I was dismissed like a criminal for it. The Colonel, he wasn't just strict. He was cruel. He believed everything could be forced. Respect, obedience, affection. His hands clenched. "But I didn't kill him." "I believe you," Miss Marple said simply. Peter turned then, his face drawn tight with grief and fury that had nowhere to go. "Then why are you here?" "To see what you are looking for," she replied, "and whether you find it." Peter's eyes shifted unwillingly toward the lectern, and Miss Marple followed his gaze. A small empty case rested on the wooden shelf there, a spectacles case. The missing spectacles had belonged here, or had been taken from here. Peter swallowed. "I came to see if they were hidden somewhere, if I could understand what happened." "You are not the only one who might seek to understand," Miss Marple said quietly. "Tell me, Peter, why did the Colonel forbid you to speak to Emily?" Peter's jaw tightened. He wanted to control her future. She was meant to marry that London man, and she would have, if she hadn't. His voice wavered, if she hadn't finally said she wouldn't. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "She refused him?" Peter nodded. "Yesterday. That's what the tears were about. She told her uncle she would not go. He told her she would learn obedience." His voice shook with remembered helplessness. "I heard them. I was outside the window. I shouldn't have been there. But I knew she would need someone." Miss Marple placed a light hand on the back of a pew, as though only resting. "And the Colonel?" she asked. "How did he respond?" "He told her he'd handle it this morning, before service, set things in order." Peter's fists clenched. "When I heard he was dead, I thought she might be free, but now they'll come for her instead, or me, or both of us." Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Fear is a dangerous thing," she murmured. "Particularly fear of losing what one believes belongs to them." Peter looked at her sharply. "You don't think Emily—" "No," Miss Marple said at once, quiet but certain. "Emily may have wished her uncle gone, but her heart is not strong enough for murder. Not like this, not face to face." Peter stared at her, and in his silence was a question he dared not voice. "Then who?" Miss Marple answered it only with thought. For now, the Colonel had planned to force a marriage. Emily had refused. Peter was banished, and Dr. Langford knew all of this, and cared very deeply. Too deeply, a new sound broke the stillness. Footsteps, not hurried, not stealthy, measured, controlled. Miss Marple and Peter both turned toward the door. Dr. Edmund Langford stood there, coat still unbuttoned, expression calm but unreadable. His eyes moved from Miss Marple to Peter, then to the spectacles case. No one spoke, but Miss Marple felt, as distinctly as the church stone beneath her shoes, that they were no longer merely discussing what had happened. They were approaching the moment when truths would begin to reveal themselves. Dr. Langford's expression did not change as he stepped farther into the church. He closed the door behind him with deliberate care, the soft click of the latch echoing faintly through the quiet space. The light through the stained glass washed his features in subdued color, rose, gold, deep blue, giving him a solemnity that almost matched the gravity of the scene. "I thought I might find you here," he said, his voice steady. Peter bristled, not aggressively, but with the sharp tension of someone who had been cornered too many times already. "I've every right to be," he answered. "Of course," Dr. Langford replied, his tone gentle, almost soothing. "No one said you hadn't." Miss Marple observed him carefully. Very carefully. He was composed, entirely too composed. A man shaken by grief or injustice rarely held himself quite so still. His calmness felt managed, as though placed consciously, like a vase set carefully where one wishes the eye to linger. She knew that kind of composure. It was the kind built to cover something else. Peter moved toward the aisle, as though preparing to leave. But Langford stepped just slightly to the side, not enough to block him, but enough to suggest it would be noticed if he tried. "I should ask what brings you here, Doctor," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but edged with mild inquiry. Dr. Langford looked at her with a faint, tired smile. "I came to check on Emily. She left the vicarage some time ago. I wondered if she came here, seeking quiet. And instead, you found Peter." Miss Marple finished softly. "Yes," Langford said, his eyes flicking toward the younger man. "Quite a coincidence." But Miss Marple noted, he did not ask why Peter was here. He already knew. Peter drew himself up. "Emily isn't here, and I've said what I came to say. I've nothing more to explain." Dr. Langford's voice shifted just slightly, cooler, though not unkind. "You should take care, Peter. You're in a precarious position." "And you aren't?" Peter shot back. The church grew very still. Dr. Langford's jaw tightened, but just for an instant, Miss Marple stepped between them, not physically, but with presence alone. "I believe there is something we must understand," she said lightly, almost conversationally. "The Colonel intended to settle matters this morning. He told Emily that. He intended to force her into agreement, if necessary." Peter nodded once, sharp. Langford said nothing. "What would that require?" Miss Marple continued. "Privacy, certainty, control." She looked toward the lectern, and the Colonel always arrived early to rehearse his reading. Her eyes moved, slowly, to Langford, and he was not the only one who knew that. Langford inhaled, a small, careful breath. "Are you suggesting I had reason to confront him?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said with quiet clarity, "that you loved the girl he meant to command, loved her enough to fear what would become of her if she were bound to the wrong man." Peter stared at Langford, betrayal dawning. But she, you made me believe." Langford held up a hand, firm, cutting off the words. "No, I never lied to you. I encouraged your friendship because it helped her. But I have known her far longer than you have, Peter. And her heart does not rest as easily as you think." Miss Marple saw it then. Not arrogance and not guilt, but tragedy. Langford had loved Emily quietly, deeply, and without expectation. And when the Colonel threatened to crush the last hope of her choosing her own life, he had acted, but love, Miss Marple knew, was rarely tidy, and never simple. "Doctor," she said gently, "where are Colonel Godfrey's spectacles?" Silence. Not long. Barely a breath. "But enough." Langford's eyes closed. Just once. Then opened again. They were broken, he said. When he fell, a small lie, almost elegant. Peter stepped backward, hurt and horror twisting together. "You killed him," he whispered. "No," Langford said sharply, too sharply. "He died struggling. It was not meant. You must understand." But Miss Marple's voice was soft, steady, absolute. "People rarely intend murder, Doctor. They intend only to stop something, to hold something back, and then one moment, one breath, one push too far, and it is done." Langford's hands trembled, finally. "I wanted to protect her," he said. Miss Marple nodded, the sadness in her eyes deep and gentle. "Yes," she replied, "and now you must decide how far your protection extends." Because outside, approaching over the stone path, Inspector Graves's footsteps were drawing near. The sound of Inspector Graves's approaching steps echoed up the stone path. Measured, certain the tread of a man who believed order could always be restored by naming a culprit. In the stillness of the church, the sound was impossibly loud. Dr. Langford heard it too. His shoulders stiffened, but he did not step back or turn away. He simply stood there, hands resting lightly at his sides, breathing with a kind of exhausted resignation. Peter, however, looked from Langford to the door, panic flaring. "You're going to let them take you?" Just like that. Langford's voice, when it came, was steady, but weighted by something heavy and real. "If I run, I condemn someone else, Emily, or you, or both." He lifted his chin. "No matter what else has happened, I won't allow that." Miss Marple watched him closely. His words were sincere, but sincerity did not mean clarity, and clarity was what she required. "You confronted him?" she said softly. "Yes, but I do not yet know how it happened. And I must." Langford didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted upward, toward the lectern where the morning's light had struck the pages of Scripture before the service that never came. "He was waiting," Langford said at last, standing exactly where he always stood to practice the reading. "I asked him to reconsider the marriage. I asked him to listen to her. He refused. He laughed. He said Emily needed guidance and that his voice caught, that I was to stay in my place." Peter's breath tightened, but he said nothing. I only meant to push him back when he stepped toward me. He stumbled. His head struck the pew, hard. I knelt. I tried to rouse him. Langford's voice thinned. He gasped, just once. And then, nothing. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Not murder planned. Murder that arrived like an accident, swift and irreversible. "Fear is a strange teacher," she murmured. "It instructs the guilty to tidy what cannot be tidied." Langford swallowed. I removed the spectacles. I folded his hands. I thought, if it looked natural, if it ended quietly, Emily could be spared the scandal. Peter turned away sharply, hands over his face. Not disbelief, understanding, a terrible understanding. The church door opened. Inspector Graves stepped inside, hat in hand, eyes immediately assessing the scene. Peter tense, Langford composed but pale, Miss Marple standing between them like a fixed point of calm. "Miss Marple," Graves said slowly, "I believe I should ask what has occurred here." Miss Marple did not speak right away. She stepped forward, small, composed, hands lightly folded. "The Colonel died this morning during a heated exchange," she said gently. "There was no intent to kill, but the death was no less real, and it must be answered for." Langford's head bowed, not in defeat, but in acceptance. Inspector Graves's jaw tightened. Duty was rarely clean in small villages. "And the girl?" Graves asked. "Emily?" Miss Marple turned toward the stained-glass window, its light casting soft warmth across the pews. "She must not be questioned tonight," she said. "Grief left unguarded can do damage to the innocent. Let her rest. Let her understand the world has shifted before we demand she speak of it." Graves considered her words, and for once made no objection. Langford exhaled. "Slow, steadying, I will come," he said to the inspector. "No resistance." He walked toward Graves, and the inspector placed a light hand on his arm. Not forceful, not punitive, a gesture of procedure, not cruelty. As they moved toward the door, Peter spoke, voice rough, breaking at the edges. "Emily will never forgive herself if she learns why," he whispered. Miss Marple answered him with gentle sorrow. "She will forgive what she must," she said, "but the truth will not destroy her. Secrecy would." Peter shut his eyes. The church fell quiet again as footsteps faded down the path. Miss Marple remained where she was a moment longer, one hand resting on the back of the pew, her gaze thoughtful, steady, far-seeing. The truth was nearly complete, but one piece remained, 'cause someone had known something they should not have known. Someone who had repeated the story of Emily's tears with too much satisfaction, too much eagerness to spread it. Someone who always knew more than she should. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, very slightly. Mrs. Finch would need to be spoken to. Mrs. Finch's cottage sat just off the village green, a neat little house with lace curtains and geraniums lined up like obedient soldiers on the windowsill, the kind of place where nothing disorderly should ever happen. Yet gossip moved through it like a draught under the door. Miss Marple walked there at an unhurried pace, the twilight settling around her like a soft shawl. Lamps were being lit one by one in the village, warm glows against the deepening sky. She could already hear Mrs. Finch's voice before she reached the gate, low and animated, confiding something undoubtedly important to Mrs. Harper. And of course the Colonel always had a temper, but to think of it ending like that, oh, I said from the start, trouble was coming. Miss Marple stepped into view, just as Mrs. Harper looked up. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Harper said, bright and overly sweet at once. "We were only discussing—" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "I imagine you were." Mrs. Finch folded her hands as though preparing for a pleasant, social exchange. "Well, my dear, you did see it all unfold. I suppose you have the clearest idea, more than anyone." Miss Marple smiled her faint, unobtrusive smile. "Oh, I rarely assume I know more. I simply notice what others sometimes forget they've said." Mrs. Finch blinked. Miss Marple continued, pleasantly conversational, as though discussing garden bulbs. "For instance, this morning you told Mrs. Harper that Emily was crying at the post office yesterday. Quite distressed, I recall, yet no one else saw her there. Curious, isn't it?" Mrs. Finch hesitated, but recovered quickly. Well, these things get around. One hears things, one does," Miss Marple agreed. "But one also chooses what to repeat and when." Mrs. Harper's eyes widened slightly, sensing something shifting beneath the surface. "And I believe," Miss Marple said softly, "you knew something was brewing. Something unpleasant. You are a very keen observer, Mrs. Finch. People forget that. They speak in your presence, believing you merely gather details, not meanings." Mrs. Finch's hands tightened around her teacup. "But the Colonel's plans for Emily were not public knowledge," Miss Marple went on. "Emily told Dr. Langford, and Dr. Langford, naturally concerned, confided in the vicar's wife, who tries very hard not to gossip, but has never been very good at hiding worry." She looked directly at Mrs. Finch. "It was you who overheard, and you who spread the news across the village before breakfast." Mrs. Finch's mouth opened, but no words came. Miss Marple's voice remained mild, almost tender. "You did not kill the Colonel, but you set the stage. You ensured tempers would already be stirred, that worries would be sharpened, that desperation might take root. You shared the news in just the right way to make certain someone acted." Mrs. Harper drew back, breath caught. "You mean she wanted something to happen?" "Not murder." Miss Marple did not need to say the word. It lay in the silence. Mrs. Finch's face shifted, offense warring with something older, more brittle. "I wanted Emily safe," she said at last, voice cracking. "I've seen girls ruined by the wrong marriage. Men who break them down year by year. I saw it happen to my sister. No one listened then. No one cared." Her voice shook. "But they listen when you make it into gossip." Silence hung, long and heavy. Miss Marple's expression softened, not judging, simply understanding the terrible human tangle of it. "Pain travels," she murmured, "from one life into the next. We must take care not to let it choose the path." Mrs. Finch looked very small, very tired, and very old. Mrs. Harper touched her arm, not in blame, but in something like forgiveness. There would be no arrest here, no scandal. Mrs. Finch had committed no crime the law recognized, but consequences did not require law to be real. Miss Marple left them, the two women sitting together in the fading light. The village would sleep uneasily tonight, and tomorrow Emily would learn the truth, not all at once, but gently, because some revelations must be placed carefully, like porcelain on a shelf, lest they shatter what remains intact. Miss Marple walked home through the quiet evening. The cottages were dim now, curtains drawn, lamps glowing softly behind them. A village night always seemed peaceful from a distance. But peace, Miss Marple knew, was often a surface laid delicately over things unspoken. She reached her gate, but her eyes drifted instead toward the vicarage. One window glowed softly upstairs, Emily's room. Miss Marple changed direction. She knocked only once before Mrs. Pembroke appeared at the door, her expression tired, her eyes swollen from the day's strain. She did not ask why Miss Marple had come. She only stepped aside and allowed her in. Emily sat in the sitting room, curled into the corner of a small sofa. She had been given a blanket, even though it was not cold, and she held it close, like someone holding herself together by threads. The teacup beside her had cooled untouched. Miss Marple sat gently beside her. For a time, neither spoke. It was Emily who broke the quiet. "They say Peter is to be questioned tomorrow." Her voice was thin. "Mrs. Harper told me." Miss Marple didn't correct the source. There was no need. Everyone already knew how news moved in St. Aldwyn's. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He will be questioned, but not arrested. Not now." Emily nodded, but she did not relax. Her fingers pulled at the blanket. Small movements, restless and repeatable. "Miss Marple," she whispered, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the room. "When I told my uncle I wouldn't marry Mr. Bascom, he looked at me as though I'd slapped him. He said I was ungrateful, foolish, childish, that I didn't understand the world." Miss Marple listened. "I did understand," Emily continued. "I understood that I couldn't breathe in that house anymore, that every decision had already been made for me, that every future was already planned." Her throat tightened. "But I didn't want him dead." Miss Marple reached out and laid her hand over Emily's. "I know," she said simply. Emily looked at her then, truly looked, and something in her expression broke open. "I was afraid of him," she whispered. "But I didn't hate him. I only wanted to be allowed to choose." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle, warm, steady. "Not hatred," she murmured. "Just the smallest act of courage. And courage, my dear, can be frightening enough." There was another silence, but this one felt different, less sharp, less fragile. Emily swallowed. "Will they take Peter? Or Edmund?" Miss Marple did not soften the truth. "Edmund will go before the magistrate. He will tell the truth, and the court will determine how to name what happened." Her voice remained calm. It was not premeditated, and he tried to undo what could not be undone. "The law will see that. And Peter?" Emily asked. "Peter," Miss Marple said, "loved you enough to be angry, but not enough to act. That is a different kind of love." Emily's eyes filled, not with sharp grief, but with something slower, something long-lasting. She nodded. Miss Marple rose, but before she reached the door, Emily spoke once more. "Miss Marple, will I be all right?" Miss Marple paused, turning just enough to meet her eyes. "You will," she said softly, "but only if you learn that freedom must be carried carefully. It is lighter than fear, but easier to drop." Emily nodded again, slower this time, and Miss Marple left the vicarage with the quiet of night gathering around her shoulders. As she crossed the green, the church bell gave a single, low toll, hand-pulled, not mechanical, a final marking of the day. The village would sleep now, but the world had changed, and in small villages, change echoes for a very long time. The night passed quietly, but the village woke early. Dawn arrived pale and silver, laying a soft mist across the green. The milk cart wheels made a slow, familiar rumble. A dog barked once, then fell silent, but the stillness was not quite peace, only the pause before life begins moving again. Miss Marple rose before the sun, as she often did. She brewed her tea, watered the ferns in her small sitting room, and stepped out to sweep the front step, not because it required sweeping, but because small movements of order are comforting in a world that has recently been disturbed. She saw Peter Hill walking down the lane toward the station. The inspector was not with him. Peter walked alone, head lowered, steps steady. A voluntary appearance, Miss Marple approved. Courage was most admirable when it was quiet. A moment later, she noticed Mrs. Pembroke hurrying across the green, clearly on her way to the vicarage's kitchen entrance. Miss Marple did not need to guess. Mrs. Pembroke was a woman who expressed sympathy with eggs, bread, and tea trays. Some people spoke comfort. She served it on plates. Miss Marple, however, had another call to make. She walked toward the townhouse at the edge of the village, the one with the smart black fence and polished brass letter slot. Colonel Godfrey's solicitor, Mr. Ingram, would have news today, and Miss Marple rarely left legal matters to the imagination. She arrived just as the solicitor himself stepped out, adjusting his coat. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, with the kind of professional calm that did not quite hide apprehension. "I suppose you're here about the Colonel's affairs." "Yes," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I believe it is time we speak of his will." He hesitated, as everyone does when they realize Miss Marple knows exactly where the truth sits. "We had only just read over the most recent draft," he said carefully. "The Colonel changed it a month ago." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "just after Emily returned from London." Mr. Ingram nodded. He removed Peter Hill completely, as expected, but he also added a clause. Should Emily refuse the marriage he arranged, the majority of his estate was to pass instead to a distant cousin in Surrey. Miss Marple did not appear surprised. He wished to control her even after death. "Yes," the solicitor said quietly, and she knew nothing of it. Miss Marple thanked him, and they parted. She walked slowly back toward the heart of the village, her steps small and deliberate. The morning mist was thinning now. Sunlight pressed gently against it, and in that thinning, everything came fully clear. Emily had not only feared the marriage, she had feared losing her home, her security, everything familiar. Dr. Langford had known this, Peter had known this, and the Colonel had planned it. Miss Marple returned to her garden just as Emily stepped out of the vicarage, wrapped in a shawl. She looked tired, but not as fragile as before. There was resolve in her now, something newly formed overnight. She walked toward Miss Marple's gate, hesitated, then opened it. "I wanted to thank you," she said. Miss Marple smiled. "For what, my dear?" "For knowing what mattered," Emily whispered, "and for not letting me hate myself." Miss Marple touched her hand lightly. "Grief is heavy, but it passes when shared." They stood together in the soft morning air, quiet, steady, present. At that moment, the church bell rang, not for alarm or for morning, but simply to mark the hour. Life, gently, was resuming. Emily took a breath, deeper than before. "What should I do now?" she asked. Miss Marple looked toward the village, toward the lanes and fields and future that were now hers to choose. "You begin," she said, "by deciding for yourself." Emily nodded, and for the first time since the morning's tragedy, she stood without trembling. Miss Marple watched her walk away, her steps slow but certain. The village would remember this story for years. The colonel, the niece, the doctor, the young man in love, the whispering neighbor, and Miss Marple, who had simply noticed what others did not wish to see. Human nature, she thought as she returned to her tea, is always the key. So many mysteries could be solved, if only one remembered how very little people change. She sat down in her quiet parlor, the morning sun just touching the lace curtains, and St. Aldwyn's exhaled. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like pages turned with care. The village spoke of the colonel's funeral, of course, how it would be modest, as befitted a man who valued discipline, not spectacle. And people spoke of Dr. Langford as well, though in hushed tones now, not eager gossip. Not condemnation either, something more complicated. The villagers of St. Aldwyn's understood that tragedy could live alongside respect, affection, and pity. Peter Hill returned to his work in the fields. He walked with a quieter step, and though some watched him, curiosity never quite dying, no one questioned his presence. He and Emily did not seek one another out, not yet. Too much had happened, and yet when they passed on the lane, there was no bitterness, only something unfinished. Emily stayed at the vicarage for a short while. Mrs. Pembroke fussed. Mr. Pembroke prayed gently over her silence, and the village, surprisingly, allowed her space. She walked sometimes in the churchyard at dawn before others appeared, a soft figure moving slowly among stones and shadows. Miss Marple watched, all of this with her usual quiet awareness. But it was not until the funeral day itself that the last piece of the story settled into place. The service was simple. A low gray sky hung over the church, but the air was still. Emily placed a single white rose atop the coffin. Peter stood near the lich gate, hat in hand. Dr. Langford was not present. He remained in custody pending the inquest, but his absence was palpable, as though his shadow stretched across the aisle. After the burial, as the parishioners drifted away in small clusters, Miss Marple remained in the churchyard. She knelt, not before the colonel's grave, but beside a much older one, her fingers brushing moss aside gently. She seemed to read something that had long been forgotten. Emily approached quietly. "You stay behind," she said softly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Graveyards are full of lessons, but they are also full of peace. One must know how to look. Emily stood beside her, hands clasped lightly. "They asked me to speak," Emily murmured, "to say something of him, but I couldn't." Miss Marple rose slowly, using the pew rail to steady herself, though not from frailty, only habit. "It is not necessary to say what the village expects," she said. "It is enough to remember him honestly." Emily's gaze was distant. "He believed control was love." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "And Dr. Langford believed rescue was love, and Peter believed devotion was love." Her voice softened further. "And now you must decide what your love will be." Emily looked at her, eyes uncertain. "How do I know?" Miss Marple's smile was small and warm when it nourishes instead of confines. She said, "When it lets you breathe." Emily inhaled, slowly, deeply, as though learning how to breathe again in that very moment. They walked together from the churchyard, the gravel soft underfoot. On the path, they passed Mrs. Finch. She nodded to them both, but her eyes did not rise. She carried a small bunch of chrysanthemums, white and simple, and laid them without ceremony at the foot of the colonel's marker. Grief had many forms. Regret was one. Emily paused, watching her. "Miss Marple," she asked quietly, "do you think I will ever forget all of this?" Miss Marple's reply was gentle but firm. "No, nor should you. Forgetting is not the work of healing. Understanding is." They reached the gate. The village green stretched before them, the world ordinary again. In the way life insists on continuing, the church bell chimed the hour. Soft, steady, reassuring, Emily touched Miss Marple's hand. "Thank you," she said. Miss Marple nodded, her expression bright with something like pride. "People are very dear, my child," she said, "and terribly fragile. But when they choose kindness, even after pain, it is remarkable how resilient we can be." Emily walked on, toward the vicarage, and whatever her future would hold. And Miss Marple, with a small sigh, turned toward home, thinking of her tea, her knitting, and the quiet comfort of her sitting room. The mystery was finished, but human nature, she knew, would always offer another. Miss Marple returned home in the late afternoon. The light had shifted to a warm, amber glow that laid itself softly across her sitting room. She took her knitting from its basket, not to work, but to hold. Her mind, as ever, was still turning gently, like the last few stitches forming their pattern. The village, too, had settled. The day had been long and full, and now St. Aldwyn's breathed again, slow and even, as though stitching itself back together after being pulled apart. There came a light knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Inspector Graves standing there, hat in hand, his expression composed but reflective. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've just come from speaking with the magistrate. Dr. Langford's hearing will go forward. The court is inclined toward manslaughter, not murder. They believe it was unintentional." Miss Marple nodded. It was. Graves sighed, a quiet release of air, not frustration, but acceptance. Odd thing, isn't it? A man can be both good and make a grave mistake, and a man can be stern and still be loved. There are no clean lines in this one. "No," Miss Marple agreed, her voice soft. "Human nature rarely offers us clean lines." Graves gave her a small, wry smile. "You saw it from the beginning, I expect." She shook her head gently. "No, I only saw the shape of it. The details came when people revealed themselves." He hesitated, something still lingering behind his eyes. "There's one thing I don't understand," he admitted. "If the doctor removed the spectacles to make the death look peaceful, why leave behind the torn wool on the pew? Why not tidy that too?" Miss Marple set the knitting down and folded her hands. "Because," she said, "guilt makes people tidy only what they already fear others will see." He did not notice the wool, because he did not remember pulling the colonel back in panic. The moment of death is rarely neat in memory. Inspector Graves absorbed that slowly, then nodded. "You've a remarkable insight, Miss Marple." She smiled, small and kind. "I've simply known a great many people, and people, no matter how different they seem, are quite wonderfully predictable." Graves chuckled softly, tipped his hat, and took his leave. The house returned to quiet. Outside, the village green glowed beneath a low sun. Emily walked there, slow and thoughtful, while Peter worked along the stone wall beyond the meadow. Their paths did not meet, not yet, but there was no longer pain in the distance between them. Only time, and time, Miss Marple knew, was a capable healer when left to its work. She sat back in her chair and resumed her knitting. The wool moved softly between her fingers, steady and familiar. Each stitch, small, ordinary, deliberate, yet forming in time something whole. The world outside her window looked much the same as before the murder, but something in the quiet had changed. A harsh will had ended. A young woman had found her voice. A man who loved too deeply had paid a price, and a village in its way had learned something about itself. Miss Marple, with her gentle patience, knew this much to be true. Peace does not come from the absence of trouble. It comes from understanding it. And in St. Aldwyn's, where people watched and whispered and hurt and cared, peace, for now, had returned. She smiled faintly to herself, adjusted the yarn, and continued to knit.